live in Cincinnati with their 7 children. So welcome, Dr. Bursa.
Thank you, Brad. All right, if the microphone cuts out, I'm done with technology. I have a lot of children. I have a picture of them. And I have a wife. So our oldest is 13. She's in 7th grade. Her name's Therese. We've got Lily over here. Goofball. This is Cecile. Audrey. Dominic. Dominic's particularly crazy. He has colored on every wall in our house. And that's Blaze. He's still innocent. Here's a better picture of all of them. This is Easter. A couple of funny stories, because it's always good to tell funny stories about children. I'll tell funny stories about the younger ones, because work will take longer to get back to them than the older ones. So Cecile, she is particularly bright, I think, and when she was about 3, I was at daily mass, and my goal at daily mass, at any mass, usually is just if I can be sitting in my pew through the homily, that's a good mass. So, with kids. So I'm like, we haven't even sat down after the opening collect yet, and Cecile leaves my pew and leaves the church, like she just ran outside, which hadn't happened before, but it happened now. So I followed her outside, and she's jumping on those giant black ants that are really fun as a kid, and maybe as an adult sometimes to step on, okay? So she's jumping on these ants, and I said, Cecile, stop jumping on the ants. I mean, how would you feel? And sometimes as a parent, these things are coming out of your mouth, and you know dumb things are coming out of your mouth, but you can't get them back fast enough. I said, how would you feel if someone much bigger than you came into your house and killed you? And she goes, I would feel dead. And I was like, proceed. I mean, it was just such a good answer. I have a lot of kids, so I needed a bigger van. My kids, this one, Therese, her 7th grade teacher is a single woman, and she had a 12-passenger van. So all of last year, I would pull into the parking lot at St. Gertrude's and think, why does that woman have a 12-passenger van? I need a 12-passenger van. So I waited until the opportune moment, and I sent her an email, and I said, I need your van. Can we talk about this? Are you looking to sell it? And she's like, yes, in fact, I am. So I ended up trading her my Honda Accord for her van, which was a sweet deal. And this van was really rocking and rolling until February, about 7 months after I made this trade, when it died. The engine just completely broke. It sounded like the Wicked Witch of the West was in my vehicle while I was driving to go watch The Wizard of Oz. Okay? Amazing. So my van is broken. I have one vehicle and too many people to haul. And my wife comes downstairs one day and she says, you're never going to guess what the 2 little kids did. Well, I guess they're not the littlest ones anymore. She's like, they went outside. So here's the funny thing. Honda Odyssey, which was my other vehicle, okay, 2011 was one of the years that the primer didn't work. So you see all these bald vans driving around Cincinnati. It's because the primer didn't adhere properly to the metal, and then the paint just peels off. So my kids took it upon themselves to expand the bald spot on my one working vehicle, and then my son ripped off that seal that goes around your windshield because they were up on top of my car. My one working vehicle. These kids, I mean, this is called dying to yourself, you know? All right. So these are just some interesting things about these children. I love them dearly. They're trying to destroy me. So today we're going to talk about technology. Usually when I talk about technology, I talk about consumption, like the amount of technology, the amount of media that we're taking in. But Mr. Mackey here came up with a better topic for tonight, and it's tied to anthropology. So how does technology affect how we understand ourselves, how we think about ourselves? So to frame this up, I want to read something to you. And this is always good to start with science, start with a statistic, and this is a pretty interesting one. So it goes like this: the gap between life online and offline is smaller than ever before. So much so that it should come as no surprise that for this generation, identity and technology are intertwined. Some have expressed concern at the influence that social media has on their identity. New research has found that for Gen Z, social media enables a new form of self-expression and creativity that empowers them to be their truest self. So this was a study by Adobe, the software company. So we polled 1,000 Gen Zs across the UK to understand what the new era of self-expression meant to them and how social media is fueling their ability to express themselves. Interestingly, over half admitted that social media was the only place they felt they could be themselves. A third of Gen Z said they found it easier to be themselves when taking on a persona or alter ego, with over half saying they've used a secret alter ego to express themselves. All right, this is pretty fascinating. I think we can draw a few conclusions just based on this. What are they? I am more myself online. I am more myself when I am someone else online. And I'm so alienated from my real self that I need to create another self as my real self. So how are we to understand this phenomenon? I find this to be so striking. How are we to understand it? How can we make sense of it? So we could obviously address this from a number of directions, a number of perspectives, but tonight I want to argue this, that such a scenario could arise that one perceives his real self to be his digital self because digital technology is not anthropologically neutral. Digital technology is not anthropologically neutral. And here I'm just following the lead of Pope Francis, who said this: we have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. So digital technology is not anthropologically neutral. That means technologies mediate anthropological visions, or visions of what it means to be human. So to develop this thesis, I'm going to move down this basic outline. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where that Adobe study became a reality, right? So this will talk about the rise of a technocratic state. Second, we're going to talk about what it means for us, so we'll get into those anthropological points. And finally, we'll talk about what we can do about it. A sort of deprogramming, right? Now, the danger with this topic is that it's massive, and I can't possibly provide all the nuance necessary. Don't want to get too technical. So really, we'll have to paint with a broad brushstroke, and we'll leave the finer work to other people, or for you to do when you leave here. All right. So that's my warning. Okay. How did we get here? How did we get here? So let's talk about the classical mind first, and kind of get a running start into this. Right? So for the classical mind, the world was perceived as inherently meaningful. It was a unified whole filled with seemingly disparate parts, but it was one that was intelligible to the human mind. So the world was perceived as inherently meaningful. And this develops over many years. So with the pre-Socratics, we have those Greek philosophers before Socrates, before Plato, before Aristotle, and they described this mystery of unity amid all the diversity in the universe. They described that as logos. Logos was this mysterious rationality that held opposites in intensive unity. If we move on to the Stoics, they saw logos as the fundamental principle that held all things together. The Stoics were materialists. So they see logos as this principle that holds things together. And this Stoic worldview was different than Plato's worldview. Plato he wasn't a materialist, right? He saw that there was a world of ideas beyond our own physical world. And our physical world, our material world, was based upon these ideas. But the problem for Plato became how these ideas became reality. How exactly does this happen? Well, Philo of Alexandria, Jewish philosopher in the 1st century AD, he's commenting on Genesis 1, the story of the creation of the universe. And Philo blends the Platonic thought with the Stoic thought. So the problem of ideas, and then you've got this concept of logos and material being held together with the Stoics. And he puts the ideas in the mind of God, as he's commenting on Genesis chapter 1. The ideas are in the mind of God, and it's God's word or utterance that speaks the ideas into reality, giving meaning to the world. The thoughts in the mind of God are spoken, thus creating a coherent reality. And we see this, right, in John's commentary on Genesis 1, which is the prologue of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, or Logos. It's the actual word in Greek. And the Logos was with or toward God, and the Logos was God. See, we see this idea taken up in Christian thought as the God of the philosophers is taken up with the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jesus Christ, the God who takes flesh in Jesus, making his Trinitarian identity known. And so the Christian vision then, in the Christian vision, the whole of reality is inherently meaningful. It's marked by an inherent relationality that foundationally finds itself in relation to its creator. So in this vision, this is very, very important. Logos precedes ethos, or being precedes doing, or custom, or techne. All right, let's make a couple of comments here. So, in his letter to artists, John Paul II has this fantastic opening where he talks about how in reality, human beings cannot create. Because properly speaking, there is only one creator. Because to create means to create ex nihilo, from nothing. And human beings cannot create from nothing. Instead, he says that human beings are craftsmen. That what they do is they take what God has already created and they shape it. I find that to be really fascinating and beautiful. Now, there's another commentator on this that I'd like to bring up, and his name is Joseph Ratzinger. And in Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger talks about how, for human beings, we cannot actually think a unique thought. Instead, we're rethinking that which has already been thought. And then he looks at that word recognize, recognize, recognate, rethink. That when it comes to engaging in reality, we rethink that which has already been thought. Our logos mind corresponds to logos, God, and his mind. And we rethink that which has been thought. And I think these two examples help us kind of get into that whole genealogy that I just laid out. Right? So let's talk about the rise of techne. Okay, so very quickly. We can start with Descartes, French philosopher, 16th century. He introduces this kind of universal skepticism, a systematic skepticism. So now anything that comes to us from tradition, anything that comes to us from the senses is called into question. We can't know if it's truly certain. The only perfectly clear ideas are the mathematical ones. Then we're going to go to Vico. So Vico's an Italian philosopher. He tempers Descartes' position a little bit, I would say. So with Vico, we can only know something with certainty if we know its cause, if we know where it came from. And if that's true, he says, then we can only know, we as in human beings, that which we have made for ourselves, that which we are familiar with. So we have this collapse of the horizon of knowledge to that which human beings have made, or techne. Now we ought not ask about the big and mysterious things, about the origins of things beyond that which human beings themselves have created. We have to remain agnostic in front of these things. Instead, we can only really ask about that which we can know for certain, which are the things that human beings have done. So this moves from an understanding, this is like a massive shift. Hopefully you're starting to see this. Because it moves from this understanding that being is truth, or logos, to saying what has happened is truth. Or we could say it this way, all we can truly know is what we have made ourselves. So this is a subtle but very important shift because it really marks the rise of modernity. Because in the classical or traditional view, all being has already been thought by being itself, capital B. But now being doesn't matter so much. Instead, what we've done matters. And our next phase is going to take it another step further. Not to what we've done, but what we can do. And we see this with Karl Marx, German philosopher, 19th century. He says, what's knowable, what we can know, matters less than what is feasible, than what we can do. So far, philosophers, Marx said, have merely interpreted the world in various ways. It is necessary to change it. So what is possible? What is practical? How can we change the world and build a future for mankind through mankind's own action? Why wait for heaven when we can build it ourselves? So it all comes down to makeability. What can we make for ourselves? And with this, I think we have something of a Marxist revolution in the world of thought. So the proletarian techne, so long suppressed by bourgeois logos, rose and overtook logos and completed the technological revolution. And when this happens, all material becomes subject to human use, to makeability. It's all like Plato, not the philosopher, the stuff my kids eat. Okay. So we have to temper a few things that we're saying, all right? So to be sure, technology or techne, in and of itself is not bad. In fact, let's look at a quote. This is from Benedict XVI. It touches the heart of the vocation of human labor. In technology, seen as the product of his genius, man recognizes himself and forges his own humanity. Technology, in this sense, is a response to God's command to till and keep the land, that land that he's entrusted to humanity. And it must serve to reinforce the covenant between human beings and the environment, a covenant that should mirror God's creative love. So the issue with Marx isn't technology so much as it is the new anthropology of man as the maker of the universe, and the corresponding disregard for God, creation, and covenant. Human craft, or human making, if we wanted to use that word, once held in check and humbled by an awareness of logos, of the Creator's created order, is now overthrown. It overthrew the idea of logos altogether, and in its prideful state, sees no limits to what it itself can do with its own power. I think we can say something like the resulting state is one of technocracy. What is this? It's a state wherein the ruling power, that which has the capacity to shape life for people, is dominated by technocrats. Who's a technocrat? Someone who's technically skilled, a technical expert, who exerts control over reality. When COVID struck, I was talking to my dissertation supervisor who's in Australia, and he was commenting on this phenomenon and the mandates and the restrictions. And he said, we've seen this before. These are the moments when the technocrats rise up and take over. And I thought that was really fascinating. And we kind of saw that sort of thing play out, that sort of mentality that we can control and dominate and dictate. A technocracy. In some ways, we're ruled by our technology. I mean, I was thinking about this when I was driving here. So I live on the other side of Cincinnati. If it were not for the car, it would not be possible for me to be here. Like 100 and however many years ago, 120 years ago, 100 years ago, this was not feasible. But now you basically have to have a car to survive in our society, right? So this is a technocracy. In a certain sense, we're kind of like ruled by our technology. Ratzinger comments on this. He says, in the technological world, which is a self-made world of man, one does not immediately encounter the Creator. Rather, initially it's only himself that man always encounters. The fundamental structure of this world is feasibility. Therefore, even the question of salvation is not geared to God, who appears nowhere. Rather, once again, it is geared to the ability of man, who wants to become the engineer of himself and of history. This is so fascinating. Have any of you ever been to Our Lady of Consolation Shrine in Cary, Ohio? This is like one of my favorite places. I grew up in Tiffin, Ohio. Anyone ever been to Tiffin or heard of Tiffin? It's in the middle of nowhere. It's close to Cary. Okay. In Cary, Ohio, you can go to this beautiful shrine. And in the basement of the shrine, you'll find all sorts of artifacts that were left behind by people who were healed. Okay? And one of these is a basket the size of a man, because they carried a man in this basket from Lima, Ohio to Cary, Ohio. And I can't remember how far that is, but it's far for carrying a man in a basket, because the man was paralyzed, and after a miraculous healing, he left this basket in Cary, Ohio. And I was just thinking about that one time when I was staring at this basket, which I do every single time I go to Cary, Ohio. Because I think, how often is my first thought, I'm going to go to God with this need? I mean, usually it's like, I'm feeling ill, I'm going to the doctor. And that's not to say anything bad about doctors. But there's just a difference in how we think about things or who we turn to. I mean, this is powerful. Where is it? Therefore, even the question of salvation is not geared to God who appears nowhere. I mean, we can just think about this in the day-to-day, right? Like, we're always profoundly amazed at the weather outside, because we live in climate-controlled environments all the time. You know, I got rid of my Honda Accord because the air conditioning wasn't working, and I got so tired of putting money into the air conditioning, right? You get frustrated, you leave your climate-controlled area, you go outside and it's like 900,000 degrees, and then you get into your car, which is like 10,000 degrees. Is that bigger than 900,000? And you crank up that AC because we can't like handle reality. Like, that's just a funny little example, but I think it's kind of fascinating. Or we think about the capacity of big tech to shape life and to shape thought, and we've kind of slammed into this pretty hardcore in recent years. Or we think about machines. I came across this great quote by Romano Guardini, German theologian in the 20th century. He says this: I saw machines invading the land. I saw death overtaking a life of infinite beauty, and I felt this was not just an external loss that we could accept and remain who we were. With the coming of the machine, this process of technical action possessing nature has reached a new stage. Nature has been seized and made ready for use. Okay, let's get even more philosophical. Technocracy has produced the hyper-real. Hyper what? Okay. Jean Baudrillard. I've been looking forward to saying that. This concept of the hyper-real comes from the 1980s, right? I was born in the 1980s. And it goes like this, that the present condition, he's talking about the present condition in the 1980s is one of the hyper-real. And it comes about in two stages. The first is simulation. Simulation. So this is some sort of imitation of reality. And over time, the simulation becomes so real that it becomes confused with reality itself. That which is reality and that which is simulated become indistinguishable from each other. And we can see this today in a really interesting way, and that whole Adobe study kind of captures this. That anyone can create a perfect simulation and record of one's life through the use of their smartphone by uploading a picture or something like that to Facebook, Instagram, where millions upon millions are continually plugging into a social world inundated with countless images and simulations masquerading as the real. Unsurprisingly, this cultural experience of shared simulation causes great stress and anxiety, as people increasingly compare themselves with the perfect lives of their friends and family. Even while everyone is well aware that these perfect moments are merely snippets, exaggerations, or even lies concerning their real existence. I once was trying to make my way down to a waterfall in North Carolina with my children and had to pause every 2 steps down a staircase because these 2 teenage girls walking down the stairs ahead of us needed to stop and take a different selfie on each step. The world of social media is a world of simulation. We are all convinced the imitation is real. Okay, so the first step is simulation. There's actually kind of a funny story and an allegory from an Argentinian philosopher, I think. I forget. You gotta read Maria Brandel's article, and it's in there. But it's this allegory where these cartographers, these map makers, try to make the most realistic map. So they end up making a map that actually covers over the reality that it's supposed to be representing, and it becomes one and the same. That's pretty hilarious when you think about it. But it's also like maybe I do that actually a lot. So then in the allegory, the map deteriorates, and it not only destroys the map, but it destroys the earth that's underneath it as well. Okay, so as the simulation falls apart, the real thing falls apart. Here's another story. I was actually at a Chipotle once. I don't come to the West Side very often, so when I do, it's monumental. I remember where I was on the West Side. I was at a Chipotle eating Chipotle with one of my former teens, because I did youth ministry for a while. Maria Brandel is actually another former teen. I texted her. I was like, I'm using your stuff in my talk. She's like, which ingenious idea are you using? So that was pretty good. So I'm hanging out with this girl, her name's Sydney, and she was rushing a sorority at UC, and like in one night had like 200 new Instagram followers. And she freaked out because it was so intense. Like the pressure that she felt was so intense that she just deactivated her account because she didn't know what to do with this new pressure of these 200 women who were part of the sorority that she wanted to get into, looking at her online. And her line to me was fascinating. She said, I feel liberated, but I don't know if anyone will ever find me again. I don't know if anyone will be able to find me. And so here you have this kind of collapse, right? The simulation becomes the real. I get rid of the simulation, and I lose a sense of myself in the process. Okay, so hyper-reality actually goes another step further, so we haven't even gotten to the hyper-real yet. The hyper-real is actually the imitation of the imitation. What does that mean? Okay, it's when the imitation of the imitation becomes the real. So here, I would just put out something like the metaverse. This whole concept of metaverse, or even some uses of AI, are kind of like getting at this notion of the hyper-real. Or we could even think of people imitating the imitations that they saw on Instagram and TikTok, and kids do this stuff all the time. So hyper-reality then consists of an alienation from what is real and what is original. Done talking philosophy? No, we're not done talking philosophy. If anyone needs to get up at any point during this talk, or if you want to start crying, I'm very used to people crying when I'm talking, and I'm very used to people eating when I'm talking, because I have so many children. So please, don't feel like you're too seat. All right, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us? So basically at this point, I think we're in a much better position to try to re-engage Pope Francis's quote. So let's put it back up on the screen. We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. That last part is basically commenting on technocracy. Before Laudato Si and Pope Francis, Pope Benedict said something very similar. He said, technology is never merely technology. It reveals man and his aspirations toward development. It expresses the inner tension that impels him gradually to overcome material limitations. So technology, in a certain sense, is both descriptive and prescriptive. It describes or reveals mankind. And this is true, right? You learn a lot about a particular time in human history as you uncover its artifacts. But it's also prescriptive. It reveals how man intends to shape himself and his future and future generations. So with the modern turn and the eclipse of God, and that successive putting man in God's place, with the technological revolution, man positions himself to forge the future for himself. And I think we can say that this is really the anthropological revolution that's behind and resulting from the technological revolution. That thing didn't just happen. The technological revolution didn't just happen. There were movements, there were currents within humanity, within the way human beings were thinking about themselves and about reality, that shaped that thing. Man becomes his own maker. He is his own maker of meaning. For logos no longer determines ethos, but ethos, rather, determines logos. With postmodernity, the whole thing is basically radically particularized. So it moves from this concept of the self-made man, this idea, an ideal, to I make myself as an individual reality. And modern technology manifests this shift and aids in its fulfillment. So let's shift the focus from technology, kind of like broadly speaking, to digital technology and social media more specifically. And I think we can see clearly why the Gen Zers in the Adobe study answered the way that they did. Why? Because social media itself is not anthropologically neutral. It flows from a vision of the human person that has divorced itself from logos, divorced itself from God, the creator, and instead sees the human person as a self-creating reality. So consequently, forms of digital media, like social media, enable the person to fulfill this self-creating ethos on the blank digital canvas with seemingly unlimited potential. Social media basically becomes a playground for a technocratic exercise of life, for simulation, for the hyper-real. So now I curate my own existence in a technological fashion. I'm a technocrat who uses technology to shape myself, rather than myself using technology to craft reality in conformity with God's will, in conformity with the covenant that God has made with creation. In the technological world of the digital age, I am my own technician. I am my own maker, and I am at home in the hyper-real. This whole thing then reveals an anthropology of self-making that flows right out of the anthropological visions of people like Vico and Marx. There's a woman, Donna Fritas. I heard her speak once. She's got a great book out called The Happiness Effect. And she picks up on all this stuff in a series of like 1,000 interviews and surveys that she did with college students around the country. And in The Happiness Effect, she says that 70% of the students she surveyed said they felt they needed to be curators of a particular image online, their online self, with respect to the audience they've chosen. And here's a direct quote from a college student. You pick a target audience, sometimes unconsciously, and you curate. You form your image and identity around whomever you're trying to please. Curating an online image is like, quote, putting on a mask, or, another quote, a game, an art, allowing users to create an imagined identity. The problem is that these imagined identities are often false. And for better or worse, these images are important because they are shaping generations to have unrealistic standards for their life experiences. And that's that breakdown of the simulation, like when you slam up against reality that doesn't align with the facade, the curated self. So this is all detrimental because it's empty. The digital self may bear a vague resemblance to the real self, but in the final analysis, it can only be an empty shell at best. It creates a sort of perpetual cognitive dissonance, resulting in anxiety and depression for many, and we know that to be true in our culture. I do think this has something to do with the nihilism that we see in our society, because meaning cannot be created through purely human activity. There's a great quote on that. Meaning that is self-made in the last analysis is, in the last analysis, no meaning. Meaning that is the ground on which our existence as a totality can stand and live cannot be made, but only received. That's from Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianity. So what can we do about it? Try to land this plane. All right, how do we deal with all of it? What are we to do? Okay. I mean, this is a really hard question. Like, how do you deprogram technocrats in a technocratic society? Like, I was really frustrated that Brad asked me to talk about this, because it would have been easier to just stop. Okay, but we do need to try to solve this thing, or, you know, what do we say about it? So, I think the thing, as I've been reflecting on this for the last week or so, I think the thing, based on what I said, if what I said is accurate and true, the thing is some sort of recovery of logos. Like that reversal, that philosophical reversal, radically changed everything. And somehow, things have to be put back in their proper place. So the inherent meaningfulness of reality has to be recovered. How do we get in touch with the real? How do we break through the simulation of reality that is the hyperreal and get back to the real? All right, just a couple of thoughts. First, rediscover nature. I teach students in Miami, Florida. I teach them because of technology from Ohio. And I was fascinated. I asked them to comment on like religious experiences. And like a bunch of them talked about going hiking. I don't know where they went hiking in Miami. Probably not in Miami, but they went somewhere and they hiked and they were like blown away by hiking. I remember taking teenagers from St. Gertrude, a bunch of suburban teens. We went to Maria Stein in God's country in the northern part of the archdiocese, and they were like, how far away from the highway are we? Like, not far enough, you know? But there's something about just getting outside and getting dirty. I think about this a lot because I spend most of my days doing work at my desk. And the experience of doing work at my desk is actually really different than when I go out on the weekend and I just do yard work for like a day. for some reason, when I come in after doing all that work outside, after getting my hands on stuff, I find myself like deeply fulfilled. That's pretty fascinating. So I think part of this is just getting out. Second, recovering intentional incarnational moments, which would be like, I'm not going to use my phone at the dinner table. That sounds kind of silly, but for a lot of people, that's not what happens. You know? So I think this becomes a question like, how can I get off Zoom and into like a coffee shop and meet that person in the coffee shop? Things like that. Restore a sense of self-examination. Examine your conscience. I need to examine my conscience when it comes to how do I use digital media. How do I put ethos over logos, doing before being? Does my digital media usage perpetuate a view that sees the human person as his or her own maker? Replace non-thinking impulsiveness with discernment and self-control. This is such a problem. Like, tonight, my kids were asking this question, like, what's it called when a word is the same word, like spelled, like from beginner, or how's this word, like, the word civic, C-I-V-I-C, it's the same if you flip it, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so we're sitting at the table, and like, none of us can remember what that literary reality is called. It was driving me mad, and I almost got up out of my seat to go get my phone, and I was like, stop it, buddy. You can do this. You don't have to Google this. It's an anagram, okay? So, I know some of you were like, it's an anagram, and others were like, what is it? You gotta tell us. So, I did look it up on Google. We eventually figured it out because my 7th grade daughter decided she was a genius and she had the answer and she was withholding it. But the fact that I almost just immediately got out of my seat to go Google the thing is indicative of certain impulses that have become part of my nature. All right? So I would say all of this, in essence, requires humility. How do we get in touch with logos? Humility. The word humility shares the same root as the word human. Humus, earth, ground, being close to the ground, acknowledging one's smallness, fragility, acknowledging one's origin as created. How do we somehow break out of the technocratic mindset? Humility. However, we have to go at least one step further. Because logos is not some abstract reality. Logos took flesh. The meaning of the universe has a face, and his name is Jesus. And he encounters us today just as he encountered Peter, James, John, the Samaritan woman at the well, Mary Magdalene. He encounters us through the church and in our sacraments. And this encounter and the relationship that ensues from it must become the substance of our being. Fundamentally, first and foremost, it is Christ who deprograms us, so to speak. If we try to deprogram ourselves, we're just perpetuating the problem. So the real key to this deprogramming then is actually adoration. Because humility in relation to Christ is adoration. I want to end by reading a couple lines from the Catechism on adoration. Adoration is the first attitude of man, acknowledging that he is a creature before his Creator. It exalts the greatness of the Lord who made us and the almighty power of the Savior who sets us free from evil. So with that, I want to field questions, but I think I want to just have you have some time to talk amongst yourselves and just react to this. What's going on in this technocratic space that we find ourselves in? What stood out to you? What questions do you have? So maybe we could just take like 5 to 7 minutes, talk to the people near you, with one person or a few people gathered together, and then we'll have some discussion as a group. Thank you. All right. I'll call your attention back to the front. Sorry to break up your conversation.
They have technology problems also.
So let's.
Like when TV first came
I'm interested to hear your thoughts, to hear your questions, and let's open it up.
Printing press.
If anyone wants to raise a question or share something that you were maybe talking about or thinking about.
Good point.
Yeah, comments are allowed. Yeah, sure.
One is Marshall McLuhan predicted this entire thing.
Can't hear you over here.
Marshall McLuhan, a devout Catholic, who didn't advertise himself as such, but was, predicted the entire string of events that we're now experiencing. Brilliant. Two is getting back to nature. I think that if you go and look at it as if it's an entertainment, a TV picture, video, YouTube, but if you go out and you just experience nature, that's good. But much better is to actually be tending the garden as we were originally designed to do.
Thank you.
Actually growing food and connecting with.
Yeah, I actually meant to make that point explicitly, so I appreciate that. So the point was, it's not just getting out and like going on a hike, but to actually like work with the material, to get in the garden. And there is a movement, right? There's a reaction to our technocratic state in things like gardening, in things like sourdough bread, in things like backyard chickens. I have chickens in my backyard. I have too many chickens in my backyard right now because we've got chicks, and some of the big birds got my chicks. Now I'm dealing with injured chicks. Talk about getting your hands on things. My wife was like dressing a chicken wound today. We're like, this is real. This is real. You said you had a question.
I did. My wife was dealing with a chicken cone that got ripped off. And I have a plucker, and that young rooster is no more. Actually, I've elevated his being by incorporating it into myself.
There we go. I just plucked some chickens by hand the other day. So.
No, he has a plucker. Here's my question.
Chicken plucker.
Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8, talks about idols, and they are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, etc. But the verse 8, those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. So, the question to you is, what is the relationship, in your view, of our relationship with technology to the thread of idolatry that has gone through since before classical?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, since I quoted Intro to Christianity a few times, I'm going to go there in terms of responding to this. So the question is, what's the relationship between this kind of technological approach to reality and the reality of idols, okay, idolatry. So in Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger talks about how idolatry, in a certain sense, results from human beings' fear in the face of reality and an attempt to control that fear by creating an idol of whatever it is. Then, if they can create an idol of it, they can control it. Does that make sense? I think that's really fascinating. Idolatry is our attempt to deal with our fear as human beings by creating a representation of the fear and thereby controlling it. Because if we can control it in our hands, we have control over it. Now, that doesn't actually work. It's an attempt to deal with our fear. But it turns out that reality is bigger than the idol that we created to try to contain it. So I think it's a great connection, because even use the Chipotle example of the girl that I was having lunch with. Like, Instagram becomes this attempt to cultivate, to create myself online, and then and that, in a certain sense, that tames my fear about myself, because I'm cultivating how people perceive me. But then when confronted with this reality of 200 sets of eyeballs staring at this idol, this reality that I've curated, there's panic. The real fear sets in, and my idol, to just kind of extend this analogy, can't stand up against it. And what am I left with? Some sort of identity crisis, at least in this case. So I think it's a great question. I think we could continue on, but...
So in my age group, I have many parents who have children that have fallen away from the church. I can't say that they're all totally involved in social media, but what do we do at this point when they're not really interested in hearing that Jesus is the answer? So, I mean, I can see how this has happened to me. It makes sense because so many of that generation, my children's are late 20s and 30s, so many of them have fallen into this, but how can you affect them?
Yeah, get them a chicken. So, I mean, I think that the first list could be helpful.
But only if they want to. You can't
Only
make
if
them
they want
to.
to. You're right. So, okay, Brad, here's the Anima Technica Vacua. Okay, so I know you wanted it, so we're going to go there. Okay, so Anima Technica Vacua is Latin for empty technological soul. Hans Urs von Balthasar was a Swiss theologian, and in the 1980s, he's commenting in the prologue to his epilogue of his magnum opus that was like 17 volumes or something. Okay, so he needed an epilogue to the thing, right? And in the prologue to this epilogue, he's commenting on how much TV European teenagers were ingesting in 1987, which was like 4 hours a week. And he's commenting on the kind of fad in ministry speak at the time that we need to meet people where they are, which is true. And in fact, we have that same kind of language in our day with the concept of like accompaniment, if you've heard that. Okay? And he says, how do we meet the anima technica vacua, the empty technological soul, where they are? And he kind of leaves it as an open question, like, can you? This was in 1987. Like, what? So I think it's a great question. I think things like having lunch, having coffee, like honestly, that sounds really silly, but I think that's actually a great starting point. Like, working on eye contact, like actually like yourself being intentional about trying to make eye contact with the anima technica vacua, It makes the anima technica of Aqua feel very uncomfortable. And that discomfort is a really good thing. Okay, so there you go. Long answer, non-answer, but I really think it's those incarnational things because human beings are craving incarnational contact.
They don't even realize that they need it.
Yeah, I once heard a great line. This guy was sharing a testimony, and he said, "Sometimes I don't know what I'm looking for until I run into it." And I think those kinds of experiences that are really incarnational help that desire to kind of like come out, which is necessary. And that is meeting the anima technica of Aqua where they are at lunch at Chipotle. All right, yeah, question.
So for people that are like stuck in maintenance, creating false identity for themselves, and they're engrossed in it, do you think to resolve that, they should take a more drastic approach, like rip off the Band-Aid, get rid of it, or like reform it and try and like mitigate it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So did everyone hear the question? Basically, practically speaking, like what should you do if you've got a bunch of social media accounts and things like that? Okay, we'll just kind of use that. So do you rip the Band-Aid off or do you somehow try to reform? I think either way works. You've got to know yourself. For me, so I had done all of this study because I was giving some talks about the issue of pornography and helping people get out of that kind of addictive behavior. And so I was doing all this reading about addiction and how it works. And one morning, I was sitting at my table praying. So I've got my Bible and my journal and my coffee, and I was like zonked, like so tired. And my laptop was sitting on the other side of the table. So I reached over, this is like not thinking, this is just like impulsive stuff. I grabbed my laptop, opened it up to Facebook. And I had this like rush of dopamine, and I was like, oh no, I'm addicted to Facebook. So I just like cold turkey, like deleted my account, and boom, like I was free of Facebook. And then I did that for Instagram. And so for me, I just needed to cut it out completely. Now I probably look at ESPN.com too many times during the day. But it's not Facebook, you know, so I feel a little better about that. So that was my case, and I know other people who did that sort of thing, but I know plenty of people who have become aware of this sort of topic that we talked about tonight, and have worked on dialing things back. Like maybe they only go on Facebook, for example, you know, once a week, or something. Like there are ways to temper it. Like I try to take a phone fast every day, where like when I finish work, 5 o'clock hits, and I just turn my phone off until the kids are in bed, which is like 5 to 8. My phone's not on, and I've survived. So things like that, I think, can be helpful. It doesn't mean I took my phone and chucked it out the window, which I do want to do more days than I don't. So there are patterns that I've reformed, and then there are some cases where I was just like, I need to be done with this. And I think a lot of people have probably done a little bit of both. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah.
I forget which part it was we talked about technology, how certain people will rule that. Who do you feel is ruling and determining
Who's ruling the
the
technological?
direction?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's kind of is there a monopoly of thought out there? That is.
I mean, that's a great question. I probably don't know enough to really make a good comment, but I think we can certainly say the big tech companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, like think about how much life these technology companies are touching day to day, minute by minute. I mean, at my desk, I've got 2 computer screens and my phone on half the time. This is an Android phone running Google. I've got Google, like my whole world in front of me is Google. shaping me, serving up ads. Like, because I did digital marketing for like a short stint, so I've got this whole like, wow, that's how the digital marketing space works. That's frightening, you know? You have conversations and stuff's listening to you, and then all of a sudden ads show up. So I think that we could certainly point to big tech as kind of like rulers of this technocratic space. And I'm sure we could go deeper in that, but I don't know enough. All right, let's check the time. 8:37. How about one more question? Yeah.
It's kind of a weird question on hybrid, because my apologies in advance, but I was thinking about nihilism. You said that it's kind of like an optimistic view of it is that people believe that they can make their own heaven, that they basically are God. I just kind of want to know your thoughts on it. It seems to me that that whole logic is kind of circular, because the idea of nihilism in the first place is that there isn't anything out there, that this is just it, and so there's no point to really anything. And then the idea that people are beautiful and that's what makes us work. That's what makes the human powerful. What isn't that kind of circular because people are beautiful because they say it? I don't know. I just kind of want to know your thoughts on it. If there's any other arguments.
I'll do my best. I don't know if it would probably be helpful to look back at the talk notes too. But so when you're talking about the people being beautiful part, like, what can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Just that our own existence is essentially what makes us.
So the nihilistic vision ultimately struggles with that, right? Because it can't see any meaning at the end of this existence. So I think part of the thing is we see this nihilistic kind of worldview all around us, right? Like, people are struggling to find meaning in life, and then the technocratic space says, well, you make your own meaning. You make your own meaning. Except that what happens when that falls apart? And so you see people putting stock in this and putting stock in that, and it becomes this kind of like, you're constantly trying to like meet the bar, but the bar is always moving. And so people are left with this meaninglessness. Is that helpful? I'm trying to kind of like paint the picture of, I think, what's going on in society. Now, how does digital technology or social media play into that? Well, this is where Donna Friedus's book is brilliant, The Happiness Effect, because of what it says is, you're always seeing everyone else's best version of themselves, and you compare that with the worst version of yourself, causing this great disparity. And you're left wrestling with that, which causes a lot of anxiety and depression, especially for vulnerable young minds that are super plastic and also super sponge-like, just taking in all of this sort of information on social media. Is that helpful? Did I get anywhere close to responding?
Well, I guess I just wasn't really expecting anything, but I don't know. It's just, I'm trying to comprehend the logic of a nihilist. I don't really see it, because it just seems like, I don't know, true meaning in this dimension, I guess you could say, would be that everything comes from something. Matters under created and destroyed, so that the only possibility is that there is something that's beyond our dimension, something that doesn't really adhere to the same rules that we are trying to.
Right, but I think the nihilistic mindset is ultimately rooted in a materialism that denies the existence of a creator, which actually makes it very susceptible to the sort of like self-making that we were talking about. All right, I'll give it over to Brad. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, thank you. That was great. Since I